So
So,
this is something a little bit different from my channel.
yeah.
I want to say the seed of this was probably like when we met for my last video about the Ballysala Highwayman.
Yeah.
I remember you talking about like potentially like the idea of me doing like longer form content on my channel. So what we've got here is a B-Tech Joe Rogan experience.
Joe Rogan podcast, check it out.
Alex O'Connor, who was like
Ask.
someone we both watch.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about you and your kind of title and your sort of area of expertise.
Yeah, so I don't know if anyone maybe recognises me from previous videos, but my name's Ben McAnoy. My background is sort of in biology, so I did my undergraduate in zoology, and then I went on to do a master's in animal behaviour and welfare, and I'm now undertaking my PhD in a similar area of sort of animal behaviour and parasitology, mostly focusing on sort of how we can use animal personality and behaviour to understand risk of parasites to people and sort of environmental hazards.
Yeah, sick. And I remember a little while ago you sent out a survey for your PhD kind of focused, or one of the experiments that you're focusing on.
Yeah.
So talk us through that a little bit, because it's quite entertaining for a bystander to hear about what you're studying.
Yeah, so the first sort of chapter of my PhD really is wanting to focus in on this behavioural aspect of people and their pets, and how sort of their behaviour can influence their pets' behaviour, and how that can influence environmental risks. So the survey that Edward is alluding to is essentially about sort of pet behaviours that they may do in the environment, and sort of dog fouling and things like that. So quite an interesting sort of survey.
I actually think my dog has participated in the survey.
Well, that's good to know.
My dad filled in the questionnaire. And I would imagine that my dog would be an outlier in the spread, just because of the amount of stuff she roots around in and eats.
Eating a lot of different things in the environment.
Yeah, but anyway, the main like idea I wanted to talk about is that the argument I'm going to make basically is that the intelligence of the Corvid family, of crows, ravens, rooks, magpies, there is a correlation between their intelligence and the richness of the folklore that they have, like historically. I guess we'll focus on the UK, Northern Ireland, because that's where we've both grown up. It only makes sense. Like across the world, would you like say that you've heard a lot of like sort of crow and raven myths and legends, like?
Yeah, I think the main thing that comes to my mind when someone says about crows or ravens or other corvids sort of in a context of sort of anecdotal evidence or folklore type stories is mostly their sort of association with death and kind of bad omen, as being a bad omen, sort of, especially with crows and in graveyards and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, and I guess the idea of the carrion crow, scavenging over corpses was kind of, I don't know, no remorse for the dead because they're just animals. I guess,
because carrion crows, as they're like more commonly known, are very common across the UK. And they are, a sort of a generalist species, which means they don't have a specialized sort of food source that they focus on, like say the way finches would be almost obligate feeders on seeds and things like that, because their beaks and their physiology has evolved to allow them to exploit those resources better than other individuals. Crows have sort of evolved to be generalists, so which means essentially that they can feed on sort of everything evenly, a jack of all trades, if you will.
Yeah,
really.
And do you think that kind of generalism, like where they fit into the food chain there, is like, do you think there's a correlation there with their intelligence, like because they're so adaptable, that has sort of resulted in larger brains, or
I think
it's, kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question because it's something that you would need really to look more deeply into, like the genetics to understand. But if we were to define intelligence first, I think that would be a good point to start. In animal behaviour, in the field of animal behaviour, intelligence to me is usually defined as sort of the ability to use complex sort of mental cognition to solve like abstract problems, sort of problems that have not necessarily been encoded in the genes of an individual through instinct. So, you know, a lot of processes that you see animals carry out and you might attribute as being, say, intelligent, may in fact just be encoded instinctually into their behaviour.
Yeah.
So just feedback mechanisms that their genes
just
are
particularly
causing.
complex ones.
So I think the key is into intelligence is that use of cognition to solve abstract problems. So I don't know if you want to maybe show the clip of the video that I sent you.
I will put up on screen the clip we were talking about.
But the clip that I'm describing, and you might see it on screen now, is essentially a man who has a pet, I think it's a pet raven, who he's trying to teach to pick food out of a container, which it can't reach it without the use of a tool. And the interesting part about it is that he doesn't show he shows the crow essentially him using the tool in a completely different way. So obviously he is using his hands to manipulate the tool, and the crow works out that if it is able to use its beak, it can do the same thing. And I think an interesting thing to note while you're watching this is that cognition is something in animals that it's essentially a mental process that allows them to solve a problem that they may not have come across, and it's usually, so some animals may just solve a problem through brute force. So say for trial and error, you know, like a dog is going to learn that, you know, if it keeps, you know, doing something that's causing it to feel in like a negative way, that it's not going to keep doing that. But that's it, not it learning through cognition, through it
it's not learning
taking
through,
a step
it's not,
back.
it's not learning through the actions that are playing out around it. It's learning because it just knows that feeling is inherently negative. It's the repeated process. So instead of it doing it once and taking a step back and sort of having this mental process go on where it works this out, it's more that it just keeps doing it until that becomes sort of like an ingrained, like conditioned behaviour. But the interesting thing about this is that the crow attempts to use the tool and it nearly gets it, and then it takes a step back and sort of seems to evaluate the situation. That's quite an anthropomorphic term, but there seems to be some sort of point where you can see the crow sort of evaluating the situation, and then it's able to go back and use the tool again and do it successfully, which I think is quite strong sort of anecdotal evidence for a sort of level of cognition there that sort of is greater than maybe other birds. Yeah, for sure. And it's interesting you touched a minute on like where you called yourself out on it, that you made an anthropomorphic kind of assumption. Inference. Like obviously us as humans are like notoriously like terrible for anthropomorphizing anything, both animal and like just objects, like not even living things. But I think in the case of like the corvids and the crows, like do you think like perhaps because of their at least what appears to be observationally like great higher intelligence, that in history perhaps we've anthropomorphized them more than some other animal species?
Yeah, I think so. It is interesting because I think we tend to, well, I think in general we do anthropomorphize almost everything that we can relate. I think it's probably, some sort of byproduct of us being a very social species, and we tend to infer emotional states on lots of different things, including other people, a lot of the time. But I think when we see animals that have a particularly sort of close relationship to humans, or they, sort of are often seen, near significant sort of human settlements or interacting in certain ways with humans, I think we definitely have the tendency to anthropomorphize them more. And I think you're probably right in saying that the fact that corvids are particularly more intelligent, in the ways that they move, it means that they sort of are able to be more sort of interactive, I suppose, and that they'll have sort of diverse behaviours across contexts. That there will be different, different crows be doing different things in different places.
Yeah,
so
absolutely. I think and a lot of these intelligent behaviours could be to do with, I don't know, items that like humans have possessed for a very long period of time, historically. So obviously we talked about them using the tool to hook something out of a particularly tight container, but there's also perhaps an even more like famous example is the idea that the corvids can understand water displacement. I don't know if you've heard of that before.
Yes, you mean about like putting stones into that is interesting in itself, because I think it's another example of that sort of abstract problem solving, where it's worked out that it's possibly it's simply by sort of a chance as first, because we already know that crows often do use rocks to sort of break into things. Like even other birds do that, like song thrushes comes to mind for me, who that species often feeds on like snails and things like that, and they use small like stones to break the shells. So it's
that's actually not even exclusive to corvids.
So that would be an example to me of like an instinctual behavior. So something that's probably coded for in the genotype or in the genes of the bird, but it may just be that the crow has been able to work out just by accidentally dropping it in, or by watching other crows. Because these kind of behaviours, I don't know if you've ever come across the example, this was something that was I can't remember exactly when it was at least it was when milk bottles were still delivered to people's doorsteps in the UK, with like the little foil caps on them.
I remember that. That was in, I think, probably I remember that in my early childhood. Like, would you have had
like it could have been, like it was probably like the 90s, like the 80s, 90s maybe. But essentially, there was this small population of, like, I think it was like blue tits who worked out that if they packed through the foil, they were able to get the cream on the top of the milk. But this is something that one bird has worked out, and this has been socially transmitted through others observing it. So
in a way, it's like it's almost like a hive mind. Like
So
they just figured out leading by example. Really.
So that is an example of it's an example of cognition, but I wouldn't say it's an example of intelligence, because it isn't something that each blue tit is independently working out. They're simply just observing another individual doing it and replicating it, which is something that, like, it is a sort of distinction between that.
Absolutely. And I think it's interesting you say that, because I think, like, I don't know, like the average like layman who's not a biologist or someone who's familiar with animal behaviour studies, like they might be able to observe like certain species of corvids in comparison with other birds, and they might be able to kind of at least infer that they are somehow more intelligent, but
Yeah.
they may not completely know why they think that, you know. But it's interesting that you've made that distinction between like just like either an instinctual or just a learned behavior by copying, as opposed to like actual, I don't know, changing of behavior based on results in the environment that they're seeing, which is
because it's definitely an important point to draw that line. But that being said, there definitely is like Corvids in general, like they definitely do have like a larger sort of areas of their brains. Like people who have researched this have done like brain scans and things like this on Corvids, and they've followed sort of like small populations or small groups of individuals of Corvids across like their lifetime to sort of see how their learning kind of develops and things like this, and it is clear that Corvids do have a greater propensity for this sort of cognition and intelligence, because just by how their brain is wired, really. It's the same way that, you know, humans, like we have a prefrontal cortex, which is essentially it's the part of the brain that I always think of it as the part of the brain that makes us human, because it's the bit of the brain that sort of differs us from our sort of other non-human animals.
Sure,
you know, it's essentially the part of our brain that allows us to delay gratification, essentially. So in infants, in human infants, the prefrontal cortex is underdeveloped, and really it doesn't fully mature until sort of mid-20s. So like through adolescence, this prefrontal cortex is kind of it's growing and developing, and this is kind of why adolescents are the way they are. You know, they're very impulsive and of sort of just doing lots of things, trying out different things,
and
because
like
it's
that kind of endless curiosity.
Exactly, it's sort of this thing where people are like you're figuring out, you know, yourself, and that's what it is. You know, it's developing this. It's cementing this sort of prefrontal cortex, this area of the brain that allows us to kind of anticipate the future and really contemplate like what our decisions now will affect in the future, and really like not any other animals really have that.
That ability to understand their action in time. Like,
even just to contemplate mortality. Like as far as we're aware, no other animals are able to understand that they're going to like die one day, which definitely makes humans different in that way. But I think I've gone on a tangent a wee bit.
No, but it's interesting, like, again, like touching on like death and mortality, because obviously like as we were saying before, that human relationship to the Corvids historically is often associated with death, especially when it comes to the crows and the ravens. I was watching the other day, actually. Hang on, I'm just going to restart this one. There we go. I was watching The Crow, the Brandon Lee film, the other day. Of course, has become more widely known in pop culture because, unfortunately, like, he died on the set of that film.
Okay, right. No, I didn't know that.
I believe it was something like stuck in the gun, like a blank firing round.
Oh, wow.
But, like, in the modern day, I feel like that is... again brought the crows to the forefront as like being omens of death. Definitely. But it's really interesting in that film how there is like an interspecies relationship between the crow and between Brandon Lee's character, Eric Draven. Like the crow acts as like the kind of intermediary between the living and the dead. If the crow is killed, then he is no longer like. He's like mortal, basically. While the crow's alive, he's immortal. But it's just really interesting, that kind of connection that there is. And obviously, like you said, it is due to behaviour. It is due to like where they hang out, their food sources, all of those things.
I think so. Yeah.
Have you like kind of talking more about anecdotal folklore? Have you like come across any like specific legends through family and friends of like Corvids or anything like that?
No, none really spring to mind. No, I don't think so. No. Have you?
Well, just I was talking to my grandmother the other day, and she magpies are slightly different, I think.
Yeah.
And I think maybe it is just because of their coloration. It's less of that like all black, and they're slightly less sinister looking.
Yes. Yeah.
But have you heard like the rhyme, like 1 for sorrow, 2 for joy?
Yes, 3 for
a girl, 4 for a boy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. There's more, but
yeah. But isn't it that like one magpie is meant to be like a bad?
Yeah,
bad
exactly.
omen?
1 for sorrow. So like my grandmother would like, if she sees one, we're like, "Hello, Mr. Magpie."
Yes.
How are all the other magpies? Like implying that there is more, like somewhere.
Yeah. How's your? I think the way I've heard it is, "Hello, Mr. Magpie. How are you today? And how's your wife and family?"
That's
how I've heard it before.
Yeah, I've heard this,
yeah. So it's sort of like appeasing that kind of
absolutely
superstitious kind of.
And it's interesting because I've read like on different variations of it, and it appears that like, at least in some form, this rhyme has existed since pre-Christian times.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Which is really interesting because again, it does kind of reinforce the idea of like. It was originally like a human, an interspecies kind of relationship as opposed to anything to do with a specific religion.
Yeah.
And then whenever you get the Christians coming in, there's like mentions in the rhyme of like of the devil and hell.
Yes. Yeah.
You know that I think it's like 6 for heaven, 7 for hell, and then there's another rhyme. You know what I mean? But
yeah. In a way, it doesn't surprise me. I suppose that it's like pre-Christian because I imagine like a lot of sort of superstitions sort of come from like a more like pagan type beliefs. You know, kind of like that sort of almost very like early religious beliefs of attributing different aspects of nature. You know, like even like the gods of like the rain or the gods of etc., like attributing like natural phenomenon to like a god for etc.
absolutely.
I suppose it makes sense in a way.
I think like university, I know less about it in other cultures, but I know like there is attachment to the gods, like either that they're like some sort of messenger for the gods, or in some cases I mean there are bird gods themselves too. There's, I mean, it's just I guess how we made sense of the world. In
I think
time
so.
Before science, really.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because I think people see maybe they're sort of burying their dead, and people are already quite ritualistic about the dead and sort of burial and things like that, and I think that anything sort of surrounding that is probably picked up on as some sort of addition to the ritual, or sort of addition to kind of the I'm not sure what word I'm looking for, but sort of that association between that, because crows will probably hang around like dead bodies and things like that,
absolutely.
And so people either see that as sort of an omen of death, because then maybe through sort of Chinese whispers, it maybe morphs into, oh well, I saw a crow on so and so's house, and then later that day they died. Things, so it sort of changes. I imagine that kind of
these patterns that are like this pattern recognition. That's
this sort
so
of
good in survival.
Exactly.
But it's so like, I don't know. It's fun. It's fun to look. It's fun. It's fun nowadays to look back on those times. But it's actually like, I don't know, quite a hindrance to like social structures sometimes. Like when you look, I guess, at like witchcraft hysteria of like the 15th, 16th century, and certainly even then, like, I mean, obviously you had like cats as a witch's familiar or whatever, but I'm sure that like crows, ravens, magpies even all played into that, as so did many animals.
I suppose just the, like you said before, the sort of colour of them being black, and sort of black being associated with death, even that, like I think it would be difficult for some to associate, like, I know that doves are obviously associated with like peace and sort of things like that, but like if a dove happened to be a carrion bird, like I think it would be more difficult for people, or imagine it would be more difficult for them to associate it with death and sort of a bad omen, because we sort of do associate white with being more sort of like positive or
well, that's interesting. So, like perhaps like with magpies, it's you get like that rhyme that's like a little bit more neutral, or there's a sense of like the great like scales. You know, because you have white and black. It can swing either way, like depending on how you treat them. So you get that sort of and that I guess that lends itself more into like a trickster spirit, or you know,
I think that
something
makes
you
sense,
must appease to please you.
Because I think even with magpies, you know, their behaviour it's definitely, you know, it's similar to other corvids, but I think they're, particularly when I see magpies, they're always seem to be up to some sort of mischief. You know? They always hang around, and they do tend to hang around it with more than one magpie, you know, in a group, and I think that's probably why people, when they only see one, they're sort of like, is this, there's something, there's something wrong with that, it seems, whereas like crows can often just be solitary birds, I think. Corvids.
I have a question for you as well. Like, when would you estimate, like, roughly that corvids were scientifically like recognized as a family? I'll get onto why in a minute, but like, would you have like an idea of like when that might have happened, or like?
Well, so the way we the way we name and classify species nowadays is based on the lineal binomial system. So Carl Linnaeus was like a Swedish biologist, I think, he was around the 1700s.
Oh, okay. So,
I don't know why 1752 comes to my mind, but I think that's wrong. But it's somewhere around the 1700s, and that's essentially, you know, like wolves are like Canis lupus, for example, like that. Those two sort of Latinized kind of words in a pair is the genus and the species name. Sure. So that structure of naming, that naming convention, that nomenclature was invented by Carl Linnaeus in like the 1700s. Specifically when corvids were identified as a family. I'm not actually sure. I would imagine it would have been maybe around then, because I know that Carl Linnaeus did group a lot of species together, but obviously, you know, since the dawn of like genetics and phylogenetics, which is essentially just the study of like the relationship between different species and how different species diverged and sort of evolved from each other. Since the dawn of that, and being able to understand actually how species are genetically linked, it has changed the way that species are grouped together. But I'm not sure when the actual family of corvids, but I imagine it was around that time, because that's when that sort of naming convention came into practice.
It's interesting, like, to know, because I don't know if you had a chance to watch the video by Simon Roper I sent you.
Yeah, I did.
But he kind of he talks about in Middle English. Obviously, I'm talking about an area here which I have absolutely no expertise in. Which his is so unique and so well versed in like historical kind of language form and how it was formed and evolved. But he talks about the theory that there was kind of an umbrella term, like I think it was crave or something in Middle English. But that included like crows, ravens, and rooks. Crave was the umbrella term that was a raven, but also could mean crows and rooks. And it's interesting how, even though scientifically there was no real reason to group them together. Clearly, like either just visually or perhaps in behaviour, there was a significance held to this group even before any formal naming term or any formal grouping. I just find that like quite striking. Just perhaps a suggestion that this relationship has throughout history has prevailed.
Because I imagine like it might be just simply like a visual kind of link. You know, like, but it's still interesting that you know, people kind of are grouped together. Like they, you know, it's definitely true that people do tend to group together like animals that have similar behavior. You know, the example that I can kind of think of is in a modern context is, you know, people kind of sort of draw analogies between like cat and dog behavior because they're common pets, but they're actually to understand, you know, dog behavior and cat behavior, you need to take a broader view of them, because they are completely different species with completely different life history. You know, like cats are a solitary species, and dogs are sort of a group living species, so they're going to have completely different behaviors because of that. But you know, birds like, you know, corvids like crows and ravens are going to be very similar because they are sort of similar species, so it makes sense that based on their behavior and also the way they sort of look, it makes sense to kind of group them together.
And I guess that's so, like, even though there was no formal naming term, how the naming how that connection was eventually scientifically founded was probably based on the same reasons that long ago people recognized those links. Yeah.
Because I imagine, you know, because you know, obviously when, you know, Linnaeus was trying to come up with a way to sort of name everything, he obviously drew on the common Latin names for different animals, you know. So like the bears, you know, are still Ursa because that's the Latin word for bear, or canis is the word for dog or wolf because that's the Latin name for dog or wolf, and felis and you know, things like that. So I imagine that, you know, the fact that word had originated before it was officially scientifically assigned, you know, it's probably then that word has then been taken and evolved into that, you know, because I imagine I have no idea about linguistics, but I imagine that Middle English it came from Latin, I would imagine, because most languages sort of in Europe have kind of came from Latin. Is that right?
It may have been gosh, we're both sharing our gaps in our knowledge. It may have been like Proto-Germanic. Is that like some of them?
Yeah, I have heard of that before. Yeah.
But
I definitely
don't know.
Because modern English is strange as far as I'm aware, because obviously modern English is very much based on like French because of the influence of like William the Conqueror around like the sort of 1100s, and isn't that right? That's sort of how sort of modern English is, because a lot of our words are sort of have an air of French to them, and when they were trying to sort of have the scribes like write down the words, they were basically just listening to the French say the words and then sort of just writing them down.
For sure, it is very much like, but I think the Norman invasion had a massive influence, obviously. But I think funny enough, like there's still a lot lingering from Anglo-Saxon times.
Yeah, definitely.
Particularly swear words, I believe.
Oh, really? Yeah.
I can't remember who I was having this conversation with the other day. I can't remember, but they were basically telling me that like a lot of swears are left over from Anglo-Saxon terms. I don't know, really perhaps like the vowels, and then the consonants were just that meatier. I don't know.
Yeah, and there is something about like the way a swear word, like it's so interesting how you know, a swear word in your own native language, it really like it allows you to kind of like let out that sort of frustration or anger. And like it's just not the same when, even if I learn the swear word of like a foreign language, like if I don't know the language at all and I just know the swear word, like it doesn't feel the same to say it.
It doesn't feel the same, but interestingly, as you said, like it seems to be more about the process of saying it than what it actually means.
And I think it is also that mental like feedback of like, you know, the meaning of it, and you know. Because like when you say like fuck as a swear word, you're not saying it in the meaning of like intercourse. You're just saying fuck. Fuck. Like it is. It's socially inferring something different, right? Like fuck, I stubbed my toe. It's an exclamation. It's not about what it originally meant. I'm not sure if you're monetized on YouTube, but I think it limits
I'm
you
not.
to. Well, we can say whatever we
I'll
want. Then.
bleep it out.
But yeah, but I think YouTube like limits you to like 3 swear words or something before it gets
there you go.
demonetized.
I'm
So
glad
there we
you
go.
told me right there
Yeah.
and then.
So we can stop there.
Yeah,
And it's okay. Like
This is
but,
I think it's a good point to stop because this camera's on like it's like 20 minutes, and
Right,
then
okay.
and then that's why I like hit it at one point.
Okay.
So we've run about, what was this, 36 minutes.
Okay.
It's pretty good.
Yeah, it's pretty good.
Yeah. If you're feel like we had a good full discussion.
Yeah, I
about
think
that.
we did. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do we want to sort of wrap it up with anything?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So I guess like my question coming into this is like, do you think there is like a tangible link between, at least our perceived intelligence of the Corvid family, and their prevalence in like folklore?
Yeah, like I think there is definitely credible scientific evidence as well of Corvid's intelligence, and I think it makes them sort of more not necessarily bold, but just more curious and more sort of likely to kind of be around humans, maybe more than other species, and sort of form that kind of link, and I think that then that probably feeds directly into people perceiving them as sort of creatures that are maybe, you know, they're not quite like other animals, you know.
Yeah.
There's maybe some sort of other entity possessing them because they act in such a sort of different way to other animals.
Sure.
And I think it is just a human tendency to kind of put our own kind of thoughts and feelings and
Anthropomorphize.
Yeah,
Word
exactly.
of the night.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you very much for joining me, Ben.
You're very welcome.
I hope we'll do this again sometime if
Yeah.
people enjoy this.
Definitely,
I'll definitely dabble more in long form content.
Yeah.
I'm not going to go as far as to name this as a podcast yet because that means I have to make more episodes.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's definitely been a fun experiment and a good chat. So
100%.
thank you for joining me.
Yeah, you're very welcome.